In this World Sociology screencast, we're going to continue looking at some of the processes that affect development, and in today's presentation we're going to focus on the role of international trade. And there are three areas that we're going to focus on during the course of this short presentation. Firstly, we're going to look at patterns of international trade. Secondly, we're going to look at both the arguments for and against free trade. And in the final section of this presentation, we're going to take a brief look at the fair trade movement. And this presentation follows the structure of your trade worksheet. So as we go through these areas, make sure that you fill out the relevant sections of that worksheet. Now, the most important thing to stress about patterns of international trade is that it's very uneven at the moment. So we can see here that the 49 poorest countries in the world have just 0.6% of global trade, whereas the top 5 countries account for 37%. The developing countries that have been most successful in increasing their share of international trade have mainly been in Asia. For example, we've got the so-called Asian tiger economies, and they include Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan and South Korea, and they've been very successful in increasing their share of international trade. And an economy like South Korea is incredibly dynamic and innovative in terms of technology. And of course, the very rapid industrialization of China, represented in this image by the Great Wall of China, has also meant that this country has massively increased its share of international trade. And China's rapid industrialization is also having a really big impact on Africa, because China needs raw materials such as minerals, which Africa can supply, and this demand for these types of commodities is pushing the prices up, and this is having a positive impact on the gross domestic product of many African countries at the moment. Also, controversially, China is buying up vast tracts of land in many African countries at the moment. And there are two main reasons for this. One is food security. So China, being the most populous country in the world, feels that it needs more land to grow food for its population. And secondly, because of the energy demands of its rapid industrialization, China feels the need to cultivate crops for biofuels. And this is a really controversial topic, and if you want to find out more, I would really recommend that you watch this documentary Land Rush, which is available on YouTube as part of the Wide Poverty series. And in these two pie charts we can see the share of world trade firstly in the 1950s. So we can see Africa here, this is Asia, this is the rest of the world, and then by 2004 we can see that Africa's share of international trade has declined, but as I mentioned earlier, it's Asia is the region that has seen a significant increase. Since 2004, Africa has increased its share of international trade by a little bit, and from the mid-2000s we can see that Africa's share of international trade has been around about 3 to 3.5%. And of course, a big difference in terms of the types of commodities that are exported by Africa compared to more developed regions is Africa mainly exports what we call primary products, so crops and raw materials. And the problem here is that the price for these types of commodities, as you can see on this graph, tends to be very volatile. So for example, many poor countries might be very reliant on 1 or 2 cash crops for their exports, and if the price of those cash crops goes into decline, that can leave them in a very vulnerable position. And being reliant on 1 or 2 cash crops is a particular problem with the challenge of climate change. So we take the example of Uganda. Uganda's biggest export is coffee, and these are the areas in Uganda that are suitable for the cultivation of coffee at the moment. But if the temperature in Uganda increases by 2 degrees, we can see here that most of those areas will not be suitable for the cultivation of coffee. It will basically just be the mountainous areas of Uganda where the coffee bean can be grown at altitude. So let's move on to the second part of this presentation, which is going to be an analysis of the arguments for and against the idea of free trade. Now you'll know that during the World Sociology course we've been focusing on 4 main theories of development, and out of those theories the one that is the most positive regarding the impact of free trade on development is undoubtedly neoliberalism. Now this idea of free trade is all about removing the barriers to trade. So free trade is about making it easier for businesses to trade across national boundaries and between different societies. The opposite to free trade is economic protectionism, and this is where national governments will try to protect national industries from foreign competition by erecting trade barriers, whereas under free trade, governments have to treat local and foreign producers in the same way. And this means the elimination of trade barriers, such as the removal of tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, and also the removal of subsidy payments to domestic producers. Now the idea of free trade can sometimes seem very threatening to people because they worry as a result of foreign competition that they're more at risk of losing their jobs or their income. However, despite these fears, neoliberals argue that in the long term, free trade can be mutually beneficial for all countries. And this belief in the economic benefits of free trade goes back to the work of David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage. And Ricardo argued that countries should specialise economically in what they do best, in other words, what goods and services they produce most efficiently, and then trade around the world for all of the goods, services and resources that they don't produce most efficiently or that they don't have readily available to them. So it's this process of specialisation that is so critical, according to David Ricardo, and was at the heart of his theory of comparative advantage. The process of moving away from economic protectionism towards more free trade is called trade liberalisation, and this has been encouraged by various international organisations, particularly the World Trade Organization, which is a global forum for negotiating free trade agreements between different countries. And also we've had the structural adjustment programs, the controversial conditions attached to World Bank and IMF loans that have also encouraged poorer countries to become more free market in their approach. And there are also many regions of the world now that have their own free trade agreements, the most developed of which is the single market in the European Union. Having used neoliberalism to analyse some of the arguments in favour of free trade, let's move on to look at the arguments against free trade. And I think the theory of development that would be most critical of the concept of free trade is the Marxist influence dependency theory. And their basic argument is that free trade currently occurs on unfair terms. It creates winners and losers, and those winners are generally the wealthier countries in the north and the losers are the least developed countries in the south. And dependency theorists would argue that the unfair and exploitative trade relationships between rich and poor countries is a result of the long-term negative legacy of the colonial era. So, for example, as we can see in this cartoon, one of the consequences of colonialism is it shifted third world economies to the production of cash crops, leaving them very dependent on a limited number of exports. And during the colonial period, local industries often collapsed because they weren't able to compete with the mass production of the colonial countries such as the UK. For example, in India, the local cloth industry couldn't compete with the mass production of Britain's cotton mills. And this has led to a situation where poorer countries mainly export primary products, food, raw materials to the developed world, and then these primary products are processed and manufactured into commodities in the north and then sold back to the south, often at very high prices. For example, coffee is a crop grown in poor countries such as Uganda, but the raw coffee bean is processed in rich countries. So the roasting, the grounding, the packaging all goes on in rich countries, and they take the largest share of the price for coffee. Even though the colonial period is now over, dependency theorists would argue that poor countries continue to be controlled by rich countries through the imposition of things like structural adjustment programs. Remember, structural adjustment plans, or SAPs, are the conditions that have been attached to World Bank and IMF loans, and these have required poorer countries who've received these loans to remove their trade barriers, so to reduce or eliminate tariffs and the reduction or elimination of state subsidies. And according to the development economist Ha-Joon Chang, there's real hypocrisy here, because he argues that it's a case of do as I say, not as I did. What he means by this is if you look at the rich and powerful countries that have the most influence over the IMF and the World Bank, such as the United States of America, if you look at their own history, their own development, they became rich and powerful through a policy of economic protectionism, which they now won't allow poor countries to adopt. And Ha-Joon Chang argues that if poorer countries are going to move beyond the export of primary products, they must be allowed to protect and nurture their industries. And in fact, he argues if you look at the success of the so-called Asian tiger economies, that success was partly brought about by a process of economic protectionism. And further evidence of double standards in relation to free trade can be found if we look at the controversial example of agricultural subsidies. We can see here, if we look at cattle farmers, very generous subsidies in the EU, in Japan and in America, and that means that poorer farmers in developing countries just cannot compete. Okay, we've nearly finished, but let's just have a look at the last section of your worksheet, which explores the concept of fair trade. And I'm sure most of you will recognise the logo of the fair trade movement. And what the fair trade movement is trying to do is it's trying to address some of the current inequalities in global trade. And it does this by supporting small farmers. So this, I think, is an example of a people-centred approach to trade. And any product carrying this fair trade logo is meant to adhere to certain standards. So for example, things have got to be produced in a way which is environmentally sustainable. There's got to be recognition of trade unions. Child labour is prohibited. And farmers are paid a guaranteed minimum price, which means that they can stay in business even if the price for their commodity goes down dramatically on global markets. And finally, the social premium is an extra amount of money that goes into community projects to help with things like health and education and environmental projects. Nevertheless, the fair trade movement isn't without its critics. For example, there are some people on the political right who are critical of fair trade because they see it as a form of subsidy that props up inefficient producers. Whereas there are some people on the political left who are concerned with the way in which the fair trade logo is used by big business to deceive consumers into thinking that the company is more ethical than it actually is.